Hello and welcome to MATV, my show Kashmir in Focus. But today we are not going to talk about Kashmir. Today we are going to talk about Israel and Palestine, uh, namely Hamas. Actually, what has happened is when we aired our last program, live program about the conflict between Hamas and Israel, we received a lot of phone calls and there was a lot of demand for a second show. So we have today invited Right Honorable Bob Blackman, who's an MP, Member of Parliament from Harrow to the British Parliament. Most welcome to our show, Mr. Blackman. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking out the time to join us.
Namaskar. Good to be with you.
Thank you. My first question is kind of also I want to learn about this. Is it not true, according to my understanding, is that Gaza was part of Israel and Israel gave it to the Palestinians to live there, and then this Hamas turns up and it's all, war, and they're throwing rockets and they are training terrorists. So
it's not quite as simple as that, as always with the Middle East. The position is that Israel was made a country back in 1947-48. There was a United Nations resolution granting Israel the right to be an independent country. Prior to this, the entirety of what is called Palestine was occupied by foreign invaders. So Egypt controlled Gaza, and Jordan controlled the rest of the land we know as Israel, and also the West Bank, all the way from the River Jordan. So the reality is that Israel fought two wars, one in 1948, and then obviously the 1967 war was the big battle, really, where Israel's right to exist was threatened. Israel won a convincing victory, defeating Egypt and putting them out of the war, defeating Jordan and driving them out of the east bank of Jerusalem, the east part of Jerusalem. Also, very importantly, capturing strategic areas such as the Golan Heights from Syria. So the reality is that that 1967 war was a huge step forward for Israel and a huge defeat for the surrounding countries. Now, Gaza has always been a part of the land that was then given to the Palestinians for their own use, and the West Bank was to be used as well for the Palestinians. The aim was to have a two-state solution with Israel in secure borders and a Palestinian state. And bear in mind, Palestine has never existed as a state. It's always been subjugated by one other country or more. So from that perspective, it is not a case of Israel taking over another country's state. It is a case of Israel being the historical land of Israel and the Israelites. So Gaza was, of course, originally run by Egypt. Then Israel invaded Gaza in order to attempt to stop the terrorism that was emanating from Gaza. It withdrew from Gaza way back in 2015 in the so-called Land for Peace arrangements. So there's a clear border, clear delineation between Israel and Gaza. There's a clear delineation between the West Bank and Israel. And the reality is, of course, that what then happened was that a number of Islamic fundamentalists, Islamic Jihad, Hamas, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and other places have really come into their own and really dominated. So the Palestinian Authority, which had an election, 12 years ago now, it resulted in Hamas winning the election in Gaza and Fatah winning the election in the West Bank. Overall, President Abbas was made the president of the Palestinian Authority, but really and truly, they doesn't properly function as a body, and this is the big problem of all. And of course, they haven't had an election for 12 years. So, from the perspective of a so-called democracy, Hamas has continued to rule effectively in Gaza by using its armed forces, to subjugate the Palestinian people. And the big problem is, as well, they've collected an arsenal of missiles that they
Yes,
use.
we will come to that in a minute. We will come to that, but that shows that Hamas and not Israel is occupying and subjugating the people of Palestine. Am I right?
Certainly of Gaza. Yes, that's right.
Palestinian Gaza. There's another issue here, that why suddenly Hamas has made an issue with Israel. Is this true? Some of our analysts are of the opinion that lately Israel has been very successfully building new ties and relations, especially with UAE and other Middle Eastern countries. And there is Hamas is being used to kind of sabotage those efforts of the Middle Eastern countries as well as Israel, by trying to create an atmosphere where all Muslim so-called countries have to take a back seat and reverse the process, or at least delay the process till something else comes up.
Yeah, well, the big problem in all this is Iran. Iran uses various different proxies to fight wars, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Lebanon, whether it's in Egypt, or wherever around the Middle East region. And obviously, Iran uses Hezbollah from Lebanon to confront Israel. It also uses Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other proxies from Gaza to confront Israel. You're right that Israel, over the past 12 months, has been very successful in signing what we call the Abrahamic Accords. These are declarations between the Emirates in particular and Israel, but there's obviously negotiations with Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern countries. Israel has had a peace pact with Egypt for quite a long time now, since the Oslo agreements. And so we're in a position whereby, slowly but surely, normalization is taking place between Arab states and Israel. And so from that perspective, that is complete anathema to Iran. We have as well a number of things. There is elections going on in Iran at the moment for their new president. And obviously they want to disrupt, Iran is a sworn enemy of Israel and wants to wipe it off the planet. And therefore it will use whatever means it can to do precisely that. Now, at the same time, there were elections planned. Israel has had 4 elections in next to no time over this past 2 years, because they haven't been able to form a stable government. Elections were planned in the Palestinian Authority, but they were cancelled. And therefore there's been a reaction against that. Fatah, who have traditionally held the majority of seats on the Palestinian Authority and the presidency, are obviously under threat by these terrorists, Hamas and others. Now, the elections were due to take place, but were cancelled. And that is the first thing that happened. So the elections were cancelled. Then the second thing that happened was there's a court case that is going on, which is a domestic court case. This is nothing to do with the state of Israel. It is in East Jerusalem, where one of the problems there has been, in 1948, many Palestinians fled their homes and their territories to depart to East Jerusalem and the West Bank. Now, between 1948 and 1967, Jordan, who were controlling the West Bank, refused to grant the Palestinian citizenship and refused to give them any land rights. So they were then given land that they squatted on. Now, when Israel then took over in 67, there's been a long-running saga of establishing who's got the rights to that land. Now, this particular court case that was coming to the Israeli Supreme Court came as a result of a case involving Palestinians who'd occupied the land, but it was sold. It was sold to Israeli settlers. Now, there was an agreement made. This goes back to 1992, so it's a very long, extending agreement that the Palestinians would pay rent and would be allowed to stay there in the rent. And so, therefore, the landlords took them to the courts in Israel, and the domestic courts ruled that the possession should be given up. It's been gone through two lots of court proceedings and was due to come before the Supreme Court. That caused a lot of the problems in Jerusalem. Then we had the impact of Jerusalem Day, the day when Jews celebrate the liberation of Jerusalem from Jordan. Now, what happens on that day is that a parade takes place of young Israelis all around Jerusalem, including East Jerusalem, which is obviously quite a massive problem for the Palestinians. Now, what we have is the conundrum. If you see the photo of the Temple Mount mosque on top of the Temple Mount, you start to understand the historical problems of the Middle East, because this is the Temple Mount and the Western Wall are the most sacred sites in Judaism. They were the sites of the first and second temples, which were destroyed by the Romans, going back to the beginning after Christ. So what happened then was when the Muslims took over Jerusalem, they built their Al-Aqsa mosque on top of the Temple Mount. And ever since the 67 war, Israel has guaranteed the rights of Muslims to go to the mosque, and then obviously the Western Wall was eventually opened up, so Jews could go to worship at the Western Wall. But there's to be no development or anything else on that site. What was established was that there were piles of rocks that have been assembled in the mosque, and also it is claimed bombs as well that were going to be hurled down. You have to see this, obviously, hurled down from the mosque onto the demonstrators that were going through on Jerusalem Day. Now, this coincided then with the Israeli police then seeking to take action to prevent that happening. So the Israeli police went into the mosque to try and secure this and prevent violence. And at the same time, they banned the marches in East Jerusalem of the Jews. So they were trying to be even-handed in this approach. But that sparked Hamas then starting to send rockets, and they sent 4,400 rockets from Gaza into Israel, which they send indiscriminately. I mean, they
So
just
these
they
rockets that Hamas was throwing rockets, firing rockets over Israel. We will come to this in a minute. That where do they get their training from? We will go to that question. But briefly, just very briefly, because our show is only for 25 minutes, so I want to cover a lot of things. But maybe we'll do another program on this subject as well. Why is Turkey so much, against Israel, whereas we see that since Tayyip Erdogan came to power, the Turkish exports to Israel have jumped from 1.6 billion to 5.4 billion. I mean, they like the Jew money, but they hate the Jews to have a country. I mean, I can't comprehend this. Can you please help me to understand this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one to understand. I mean, I think back in 2010, you may recall Israel and Turkey have had good relationships, and then but they blockade Gaza. And one of the reasons why they blockade Gaza is to prevent these missiles and other munitions getting through into Gaza that can then be used against Israel. And Turkey sponsored a flotilla of boats to try and break the blockade, including taking arms into Gaza. The Israeli Navy then boarded these vessels and apprehended them. That caused a breakdown in relations between Israel and Turkey, which, that's been a bit fraught, frankly, for the last 11 years. It slowly but surely got improved as time has gone on, but it is a case of, it's a bit like you say, what the Palestinians try to do, in particular Iran, particularly Hamas and so on, they try to unite the Muslim world against Israel, whereas Israel is reaching out now and formulating friendly relations with a large number of countries, which means that the one problem we have here is that Hamas refused to accept Israel's right to exist. And as far as they're concerned, they want to kill as many Jews as they can wherever they are in the world. And this is the sworn decision of Hamas, which is why no one can negotiate with Hamas.
So, first of all, I have doubts about Islam, these Arab nations being Islamic nations, because I think if Islam was to be a nation or a national identity, then Pakistan would not have been broken into two, and Bangladeshis would not have left the West Pakistan because they were united by the bond of Islam. So I think that we should stop calling them as Islamic nations and call them Arab nations, or because they are all Arabs. My final question
but they split into because there are different sects within Islam, Sunni and Shia. They are very much opposed to one another. In fact, they probably hate each other more than they hate other religions. So there's that problem in the world, and there is this battle between Saudi Arabia and Iran for dominance in the region.
Yeah, and that goes way back thousands of years. The conflict between the Arab expansionists and the Persian, empire fighting. So one of the things that I have made inquiries about, and my team back in Pakistan has been working on it, and we have found out that the Pakistan Army and the Secret Service are directly involved in training Hamas militants, and they go to Pakistan in the guise of Palestinian authorities, military, but they are actually Hamas, and they are trained in the Pakistan military academy in Abbottabad, from stone's throw distance. Our Osama bin Laden was captured and
so close to the line of control by the sound of it.
And in that one, they are trained in the War College in Islamabad, Naval College in Karachi, Rasalpur Air Base. They are being trained. About 30 to 40 Hamas are trained. Plus, we have also found out that there is the SSG group, Special Services Group, which is the commando group. There's a unit of that commando group stationed in Gaza. So how do you look at this situation?
Well, I've not been privy to that information, and I welcome the evidence that backs that up, because clearly we are concerned about Pakistan's role in assisting in this case. Pakistan was very quick to come out and support Hamas when the current conflict began, which surprised many people in the United Kingdom, I think, because we hadn't thought that Pakistan were involved in this way. But if you've got evidence that this is the case, and I'm not disputing it, but I think we'd like to see it, and I think our Foreign and Commonwealth Office should look at it, because that makes it even more difficult and more serious, potentially, in terms of the damage it's doing to Middle East relations. And what we don't want to see is a tie-up between Pakistan and Iran. That will be even worse from that perspective, because that will not help anyone.
So now we see that there is a very fragile ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. Even though that there is this ceasefire, we have seen immediately after the announcement of ceasefire, they have been using Baitul Maqdis and Masjid Aqsa. And again, the Hamas people disguised as worshippers have entered it, and they have been stone paddling, rock paddling actually, the big rocks. So how do you see the future? You have got 3 minutes to explain.
Yeah, very, very difficult. As we said, they launched 4,400 rockets into targeted at civilian targets in Israel, both Shaddad, Ashkelon, but also Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and other cities. Fortunately, Israel has the Iron Dome and destroyed most of those rockets before they got anywhere. But, and this is the big but, it's estimated that over 400 rockets that they targeted at Israel actually landed back in Gaza and caused civilian deaths. So they will continue to suppress the people of Gaza, I'm afraid. And the reality is that until such time as they're removed, then and their commanders removed from operations, then they will still remain a threat to the state of Israel. And clearly, they'll aim to cause trouble.
Until and unless the commanders are removed, and until and unless the terrorist infrastructure of Hamas is dismantled, the threat of another attack or instigation or provocation will always remain there. That is what we think. We should conclude our program with the Right Honourable Member of Parliament, British Member of Parliament, Bob Blackman. And Bob, thank you very much for joining us. We would love to have a program over the Pakistani-occupied Jammu Kashmir and Pakistani-occupied
I'd be very pleased to talk on that.
Because in your parliament, there is always someone standing up and talking about atrocities. I don't know which atrocities, but so-called atrocities taking place in Indian Union territory of Jammu Kashmir, but no one stands up in the parliament, British parliament, talks about us. I come from the Pakistani-occupied Jammu and Kashmir, and we will definitely have you once again. Thank you
I'd
very
be very
much
pleased
for
to come
joining
on.
us.
Yeah. Namaskar.
Thank you. Namaskar. Thank you very much for joining us, and that is all for today, and I will see you again now on Thursday.